The old world order really is collapsing right before our eyes, and President Trump is making it worse. At the G7 summit, world leaders focused mostly on avoiding a Trump meltdown, and they found themselves rendered impotent and irrelevant largely as a consequence. Meanwhile, Trump left early because he was eyeing his possible transformation from so-called peace president to maybe becoming a war president. I mean, maybe. Will he? Won't he? In any case, a lot of important things are happening, so let's discuss. As I've covered here numerous times, the minute Donald Trump became president again and talked about using force possibly to take Greenland, and economic force possibly to annex Canada, it was clear that things were changing profoundly. As the G7 summit came together, fixated on managing Trump like he was a two-day endurance test, it was actually marking the turning point from the old rules-based order that America put into place and championed to a new, ruthless, might makes right world order. Now, historically, the accompaniment to such a shift is a heightened level of conflict and uncertainty, exactly the sort of thing that we're seeing now. And you should expect that it will change the way that the world works, who's influential, who's rendered impotent. Most of the G7 leaders who just met in Canada will be wondering, I expect, if they might have ended up on the impotent end of that scale, because that's how it looked. The G7 was all about the rules-based order after all, because the G8 became the G7 when Russia was expelled for breaking the rules, asserting its might-makes-right logic by invading Crimea in 2014. The G7 that resulted was intended for the world's largest democratic nations to show solidarity in the face of such world challenges. Now here they were desperately trying to get through 2 days where the illusion of solidarity could be preserved when everyone knew that the reality had clearly broken down. And of course not least because one of their number, the most powerful amongst them, is no longer committed to what were previously shared democratic values. So Trump immediately threw a great big stone into the quiet pond of unity by declaring that it was a big mistake, that his authoritarian buddy Vladimir Putin was no longer invited to these shindigs. And look, it was pretty much a fair point, because if the G7 leaders were going to go out of their way to appease and fawn over a strongman authoritarian leader called Donald Trump, then on what grounds did they have left for expelling Russia? The others, let's call them the G6, wanted still to make strong moves on further sanctions on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. The UK publicly announced a new hard-hitting set of sanctions, for instance. All of it undermined when Trump questioned the whole point of sanctions against Russia, moaning that they, quote, cost a lot of money. Well, so do military parades, of course. But I digress. Unsurprisingly, Trump didn't bother to go ahead with what had been a planned meeting with Ukraine's President Zelensky. He also stood up the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who'd been counting on a scheduled meeting with the President, primarily to discuss the recent announcement that the United States was reconsidering its AUKUS agreement to provide his country with nuclear-powered submarines. A rather important item for him. Well, Trump dropped that. He also dropped meetings with Mexico and India and South Korea, because even before day one was finished, the president decided to show his contempt for the whole shebang and announced that he would be travelling back to the US early. Hovering over the summit was the shooting war between Israel and Iran. Now, initially, Trump had said that he was against the idea that Israel should carry out such an attack. But after it just ignored him and went ahead anyway, he came around. He seemed to give it his support. Once it became clear that Iran was not as well set up to respond as many had feared that it might be. The G7 jumped through President Trump's hoops to try and come up with a joint communique they could all sign up to on the subject, and they got a form of words, but really it didn't matter. Israel didn't care what the G7 had to say on the topic, Iran certainly didn't, and Trump had no intention of tying his hands to anything that the impotent others might put forward. What Trump does like, however, is playing the game of will he, won't he. The suggestion now that Trump might be ready to get the United States directly involved in the war, perhaps to use its big bunker-busting bombs to blow up Iran's nuclear enrichment base, something that Israel can't do alone. But will he? Well, as he left the summit, he said he was having to leave in order to carry out something big. French President Macron suggested this might be to organise a ceasefire. Maybe a bit of wishful thinking there. Anyway, Trump slapped him down on social media. It was much bigger than a ceasefire, he said. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer suggested that nothing the president has said suggests he's about to get involved in this conflict. Well, then Trump posted the demand for Iran, in all caps of course, unconditional surrender. And that followed a post where he'd said this: "We now have complete and total control of the skies over Iran. Iran had good sky trackers and other defensive equipment, and plenty of it, but it doesn't compare to American-made, conceived and manufactured stuff. Nobody does it better than the good old USA." And if you thought that might only accidentally be directly associating the US with Israel's actions, he went on to say this: "We know exactly where the so-called supreme leader is hiding. He is an easy target, but he's safe there. We are not going to take him out, brackets kill, at least not for now. But we don't want missiles shot at civilians or American soldiers. Our patience is wearing thin." This is all behaviour in keeping the nature of Trump, the bully who does not pick fights with people who might be strong enough to really fight back. When it was an open question how much capability Iran had, Trump was trying to negotiate and telling Israel not to attack. Once they'd ignored that and attacked anyway, and it became obvious that while Iran had missiles that could hurt Israel a bit, ultimately they were sufficiently degraded and weakened that they didn't represent as big a threat had been feared. Suddenly, Trump is now contemplated joining in. For the decisive strike, the big man moment. It is entirely consistent. Part of his MAGA base is in uproar, because they believed it was a point of principle that gloriously isolationist America did not get involved in foreign wars. But wasn't Trump's principle, per se, because he doesn't really have those. He demonstrated with his comments on Greenland that he was perfectly willing to contemplate exactly that with smaller entities who can't fight back. In terms of the nature of authoritarian America, though, this constitutes something of a dangerous line that might be about to be crossed. Trump has ordered small strikes against individual targets. He hasn't yet ordered his military into a full-scale war situation. If he does that, and there's no reason to think the US military won't do a solid job of it. I mean, they haven't replaced the pilots with real estate agent billionaires. Not yet, anyway. But if he does that, and it goes well, he will like it. He will have crossed the line and tasted the rush of beating up the other guy. You know, the red meat that has nourished strongman leaders through history. Rather like when a wild animal has first tasted human flesh, and from that point on they are much more likely to attack again. So, yeah, this would not be a good precedent for the world order. Now, while all of that's going on, it's interesting to note what's happening, or rather, what's not happening with Russia. Before this big shifting moment, Russia, along with China, of course, was an ally of Iran. Iran sent it badly needed drones in the first year of its invasion of Ukraine. They signed a strategic partnership treaty with Putin, declaring closer mutual defence ties. Well, now Iran is facing an existential threat from Israel, and maybe from the United States. Russia, meanwhile, has left the chat. Obviously, Russia is focusing its resources on Ukraine, while Israel and Iran have been kicking off. Putin has been taking the opportunity to hit Ukrainian cities with everything he's got, now that no pesky Americans are going on and on about peace talks or similar nonsense. And this brings us back to the cold, pragmatic way that these authoritarian states treat their alliances with each other. They are marriages of convenience. Russia has no sense of shared values or kinship with the Ayatollahs of Iran. Not really. Indeed, it's known that Vladimir Putin also doesn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. And Putin also does want to keep improving relations with Trump's America, so long as it doesn't require him to compromise in the slightest with his attacks on Ukraine. After all, the G7 gave yet another example of where that worked to his favour, with Trump presenting his own grievances to them that they exclude Russia from the G7 table. So the more Russia can support Trump on other things that he wants to do, like maybe acting as an intermediary in getting Iran to the table, the happier Putin is. So it was that after the attacks began, Vladimir Putin called both the leaders of Iran and Israel and then talked to Trump directly to brief him on what had been said. Now, in so doing, he might well alienate the Iranians, who have some degree of justice in feeling that Russia hasn't entirely delivered on support that it had been promised. But unlike with China, Putin will accept that if it serves his broader interests. He is also interested in continuing to develop closer relations with some of the other Arab states, who generally also do not want Iran to be gaining nuclear weapons. In the might makes right world order, there are no enduring alliances, just the respect that power gives to power, and the changing priorities the minute that that power is lost or diminished. That is the ruthless power play that you select for once you've established that sort of world order. Leaders who have extreme competence in the use of violence, who have high levels of cunning and strategy for exactly that game, and who sublimate human empathy and mercy to their own goals. Those are the leaders who increasingly become the ones that rise to the top, because that's what the system rewards. And it's why President Trump, who did more than anyone to usher this change in, believing that it would benefit the United States with its powerful military and its powerful economy, it's why he is deluding himself that he personally is well suited to thrive in that environment. Meanwhile, at the time of shooting this video, that game of will he, won't he is still going on. Historically, Trump likes to stretch out those moments for as long as possible because it puts him at the centre of attention. It's exactly what he did with Ukraine. It's now exactly what he's doing with Iran. And at least half of his base of support will go with him wherever he wants them to, even if the other half have suddenly noticed to their shock that what he does isn't entirely consistent with what he said he would do. No kidding. Well, at least you've noticed that much. Trump hit back publicly at Tucker Carlson, for instance, asking if someone could tell kooky Carlson that Iran must never have a nuclear bomb. J.D. Vance, who has previously been outspoken on limiting American involvement in other people's wars, was much more silkily squaring the circle on Twitter, saying that of course he was biased towards his friend, the president, and of course Trump had been consistent in always saying that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And he wanted to point out the restraint Trump had shown in keeping the military's focus on protecting US citizens. He didn't mention Greenland at this point, but anyway. But he believed the president had earned some trust on this issue. Yeah, good luck with that. If you develop a base via the endorsement of mad conspiracy theories and rampant suspicion of whatever the government's doing, you shouldn't be so surprised when that mindset turns out to be a little difficult to control once it's you that's in charge. The administration's challenge on that front was reflected in the replies to Vance's tweets, which were mostly MAGA and mostly, shall we say, not persuaded. Incidentally, I mentioned Greenland a couple of times. We knew, because it leaked, as I covered previously, that America has been directing its spies to go into Greenland to work out the best ways of creating division there and create other circumstances that might further Trump's aims of taking it over. Apparently, insiders have also told journalists in the last day or two that Trump slapped Macron down so tetchily on social media because he was angry at the fact that the night before the G7 summit, Macron visited Greenland in person to show solidarity with them, to state that yes, they are a free country and nobody should think they can simply be bought. Just another indicator that Trump's obsession in that direction seems not to be going away. If I was a leader in Greenland or Denmark, I would have been watching Trump leaving the G7 early, shouting unconditional surrender as he ran as he does so, with the remaining leaders looking helplessly on. That would look to me like the most powerful symbol yet of the rules-based order that is my last defence against US military predation going away. And I'd be feeling pretty nervous right now.